Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
All right, welcome to Wednesday, the first Wednesday in the month of May. And this time Joe's going to be talking about the end of World War II. Because he's on a war track for some reason recently. Maybe because Memorial Day is coming up at the end of the month. Be prepared for that. My pictures are going to be mostly child related because of Mother's Day coming up this weekend. I will wish everybody a happy Mother's Day on Friday. There will probably be a short on Sunday if we can figure out how to do one. Or what we want to do for one. Anyway. I've chosen a hedgehog race because, I don't know, I wanted to. That seems like a valid reason. Are you guys ready? Are you ready? Here we go. Also, shout out, we'll be finished on Friday. That will have Mother's Day's pictures. So here we go. And stickers. Here we go. I keep saying here we go. I'm on a roll today. I'm sorry, guys. I'm tired. Ready? Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. Here's our read. And start. Here we go. All right, so we've got She Stole. We got Laura. There's John. There's Lynn. There's They. There's Faces. There's Ron. There's Crazy Train. There's To Eat and Keep Digging. There's Sheena. There's Steve and Tina. There's Darmin. There's Popcorn. There's Demi. There's Patty. There's Scrapping. There's Eric. There's Alice. There's Chronicles. Carnival. There's Blended. Scully. Kate. Strong Mind. Let's see. There's DG. There's Hacking Ontario. There's Reeve. There's Railroad. Let's see. Who else? There's Jocelyn. There's Blistering, who's trying to take the lead. Oh, wow. I got some people coming from the back. It's going to be Wisdom. Hang on, Wisdom. Okay. This is Wisdom Sparks Motivation. Ignite faith, inspiration, inspire growth, I can read, and illuminate God's path. So this is one of our religious motivational channels. And you can see lots of videos about God, and there's some scriptures. That's what those are called. I knew the word. You've got some shorts, which of course are more scriptures. And we got some lives. So if you need motivation or interested in religion, it's a good place to go. Hang out, like, share, and enjoy the bearded historian rambling about this, that, and everything else. Have a good day. Okay, now let's try it. Go.
Go.
Where are you going?
Well, we're going up the side wall here and over across the ceiling and down the other wall.
That seems silly.
Just a little bit. It's called 4 walls. Anyway, we need to talk on a topic.
We do?
A very short one if I wanted to do it that way. I would say May 8th, World War II in Europe ended. Oh, boy, that was fall, wasn't it? I better put some detail in on that.
What? Why?
Okay. Well, if you think about World War II, you think about one of the most costliest wars involving millions upon millions of soldiers, dead, wounded, captured, etc. It all basically came to an end. You know, it started coming apart for the Germans in 1944 and 1945. But the key steps to this fallback, as it was, you know, first of all, 1944, like they were mentioning, a lot of prisoners were taken. They had, like in April of 1945, 1.5 million soldiers were captured on the Western Front. They also saw 120,000 German troops by Western allies in the last campaign of the war in Italy. On the 3 to 4 months up to the end of April, over 800,000 German soldiers surrendered on the Eastern Front. I mean, literally, it was closing in on Germany from every direction. In early April, the first Allied-governed Reichswager camp were established in Western Germany to hold hundreds of thousands of captured or surrendered Axis forces personnel. SHAEF headquarters, Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, would reclassify prisoners as disarmed enemy forces, not POWs. They claim that legal fiction would circumvent provisions of the Geneva Convention of 1929 on the treatment of former combatants. They say by October thousands had died in the camps of starvation, exposure, and disease. The big thing is Germany already bombed to pieces. Its own citizens are starving to death. And now you're going to drop, 800,000 enemy combatants in the countryside and somehow find food for them. Would be a little difficult to keep everybody alive. Now, some of the other things that would be discovered, obviously, was the liberation of Nazi concentration camps and refugees. Allied forces started to discover the scale of the Holocaust. The advance into Germany would uncover numerous Nazi concentration camps and forced labor facilities. 60,000 prisoners were at Bergen-Belsen when it was liberated on the 15th of April, 1945 by the British 11th Armored Division. 4 days later, troops from the American 42nd Infantry would discover Dachau. Allied troops forced the remaining SS guards to gather up the corpses and place them in mass graves. Due to the prisoners' poor physical condition, thousands would continue to die after liberation. The captured SS guards were subsequently tried at Allied war crime tribunals, where many were sentenced to death. Some Nazi guards and personnel were killed outright on the discovery of their crimes. However, up to 10,000 Nazi war criminals would eventually flee Europe using rat lines. Now, on April 25th, 1945, the last German troops would get out of Finland through the Finnish Lapland and made their way to the occupied Norway. On the 27th of April of 1945, a photograph showing the raising of the flag on the three-country cairn was photographed. And on the 25th of April, 1945, Italian partisans liberated Milan and Turin. 2 days later, Allied forces were closing in on Milan. The Italian dictator, Benito Mussolini, was captured by Italian partisans. It's disputed on whether he was trying to flee from Italy to Switzerland and was traveling with the German anti-aircraft battalion. On the 28th of April, Mussolini was executed in Guino, a civil parish of Metzgera. The other fascists captured with him were taken to Dongo and executed there. Now, the bodies were taken to Milan and hung up on the Piazzale Loreto of the city. On the 29th of April, Raffaello Graziani surrendered all fascist Italian armed forces at Cassatera. This included Army Group Ligura. Graziani was the Minister of Defense for Mussolini's Italian Social Republic. Now, the one date a lot of people have memorized, the 30th of April. This is when, as the Battle of Nuremberg and the Battle of Heimberg ended with American-British occupation, the Battle of Berlin was still raging. Soviets had surrounded Berlin and cutting off his escape route by the Americans. Hitler, deciding and realizing that all was lost and not wishing to suffer Mussolini's fate, died by suicide in his Führer bunker, along with his long-term partner, Eva Braun, whom he had married less than 40 hours earlier. In his will, Hitler would dismiss Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the second in command, and the Interior Minister, Heinrich Himmler, after each of them had separately tried to seize control of the crumbling remains of Nazi Germany. Hitler, appointing his successors as follows: Admiral Karl Dönitz was the new President of Germany, while Joseph Goebbels was the new chancellor. However, Goebbels would die by suicide the next day, leaving Dönitz as the sole leader of Germany. How to be a leader of a crumbling country.
Woo!
Now, German forces in Italy on the 29th would surrender before Hitler died. Oberstleutnant Schweinitz and Sturmbannführer Werner basically serving as General Oberst Heinrich von Weddinghoff and SS Commander Karl Wolff would sign a surrender document as Cassatera after prolonged, unauthorized secret negotiations with the Western Allies, which were viewed with great suspicion by the Soviet Union as they were trying to reach a separate peace. In the documents, the Germans agreed to a ceasefire and surrender of all the forces under the command of Wittinghoff on the 2nd of May at 2 p.m. Accordingly, after some better wrangling between Wolff and Albert Kesselring in the early hours, nearly 1 million men in Italy and Austria surrendered unconditionally to British Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander on the 2nd of May at 2 p.m. Well, here's 1 million people that are now surrendering. The Battle of Berlin would end on the 2nd of May as well, and that date General der Artillerie Hillwith Wielding, the commander of the Berlin defense area, would unconditionally surrender the city to General Vasily Shukov of the Red Army. On the same day, officers commanding the two armies, Army Group Vistula, north of Berlin, Generals Kurt von Kipskirch, commander of the German 21st Army, and General Hassel von Manufel, commander of the 3rd Panzer Army, would surrender to Western Allies. The 2nd of May is also believed to have been the day when Hitler's deputy, Martin Bormann, died, from the account of Arthur Axmann, who saw Bormann's corpse in Berlin near the Lehrter Bahnhof railway station after encountering a Soviet Red Army patrol. Lehrter Bahnhof is close to where the remains of Bormann, confirmed by his DNA on a test in 1998, were unearthed on the 7th of December, 1972. Apparently their bodies stacked so deep they couldn't find him for a while. Now, on May 4th, 1945, the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery took the unconditional military surrender at Lüneburg from General Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg and General Eberhard Kinzel of all German forces in Holland and northwest Germany, including the Frisian Islands and Helgoland, and all other islands in Schleswig-Holstein and in Denmark, including all naval ships in these areas, at the Temelenburg on Lüneburg Heath, an area between the cities of Hamburg, Hanover, and Bremen. The number of German land, sea, and air forces involved in this surrender amounted to 1 million men. On the 5th of May, Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boats to cease offensive operations and return to their bases. On the 5th of May, German Oberschaefer Netherlands Supreme Commander Johannes Waskowitz surrendered to the 1st Canadian Corps Commander, Lieutenant General Charles Folks, in the Dutch town of Wenningen in the presence of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who was acting as Commander-in-Chief of the Dutch Interior Forces. German forces in Bavaria would surrender on the 5th of May at 2:30 in the afternoon. General Hermann Feuchert surrendered all forces between the Bohemian Mountains and the Upper Inn River to American General Jacob L. Devers, commander of the American 6th Army Group. On the 5th of May, 1945, the Czech resistance started the Prague Uprising. The following day, the Soviets launched the Prague Offensive. In Dresden, Gautier Martin Lechman let it be known that the large-scale German offensive on the Eastern Front was about to be launched. Within 2 days, Lechman abandoned the city but was captured by Soviet troops while trying to escape. On the 6th of May, Reichsmarschall and Hitler's second-in-command, Hermann Göring, would surrender to General Karl Spaatz, who was the commander of the operational United States Air Forces in Europe, along with his wife and daughter at the German-Austria border. German forces in Breslau would surrender on the 6th of May. General Hermann Neuhoff, the commandant of Breslau, a fortress city surrounded and besieged for months, would surrender to the Soviets. Now, 30 minutes after the fall of Fortress Breslau, General Alfred Jodl arrived at Reims and, following Dönitz's instructions, offered to surrender all forces fighting the Western Allies. This is exactly the same negotiating position that von Friedberg had originally made to Montgomery, and like Montgomery, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, threatened to break off all negotiations unless the Germans agreed to complete, unconditional surrender to all the Allies on all the fronts. Eisenhower explicitly told Jodl that he would order Western lines closed to German soldiers, thus forcing them to surrender to the Soviets. Jodl sent a signal to Dönitz, who was in Flensburg, informing him of Eisenhower's declaration. Shortly after midnight, Dönitz, accepting the inevitable, sent a signature to Jodl, authorized the complete and total surrender of all German forces. Now, the Channel Islanders were informed about the German surrender after. On the 8th of May at 10 a.m., the Channel Islanders were informed by German authorities that the war was over. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made a radio broadcast at 3 o'clock in which he announced hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, but in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded all along the front, and our near Channel Islands are also to be freed today. At 2:41 in the morning of the 7th of May at SHAEF headquarters at Reims, France, the Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, General Alfred Jodl, signed an unconditional surrender document for all German forces to the Allies. General Franz Bonn announced the unconditional surrender of German troops in Norway on the 7th of May and included the phrases, all forces under German control to cease active operations at 20:31:01 hours Central European Time on the 8th of May 1945. The next day, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and other General Oberkommando West representatives would travel to Berlin, and shortly before midnight would sign another document of unconditional surrender, this time again surrendered to all Allied forces, this time in the presence of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and representatives of SHAEF. The Soviets wanted to make sure that they got their slice of the pie too.
What?
Now, the signing would take place at the former German Army Engineering School in the Berlin district of Karlhorst, and it now houses the Museum Berlin-Karlhorst. Now, part of the details regarding this whole happy trade-off that they had, there was a time that the Germans wanted to make a deal with the Allies in Reims, but it was not recognized by the Soviet Union. They wanted another signature, like they said, in Berlin, where the seat of government in Nazi Germany, from where the aggression had been initiated. Therefore, also the document needed to be signed. In addition, immediately after signing the first document, the German forces were ordered to cease fire in the west and continue fighting in the east. Well, Germany, under the Flensburg government, led by the head of state Dönitz, also accepted the Allied suggestion to sign a new document. The document was signed at the seat of Soviet military administration in Germany, again Karlhorst, by representatives from the Oberkommando West and the AEF, represented by British, the Supreme High Command of the Soviet Red Army, further French and American representatives signing as witnesses. This time, Keitel was the highest-ranking representative, so he would do the duty. And the surrender document also led to the de facto fall of Nazi Germany. As one result of the German downfall, Allies had de facto occupied Germany since the German defeat, which was later confirmed via the Berlin Declaration by the four countries of the Allies and a common representative of New Germany on the 5th of June, 1945. Interestingly enough, there were three versions of the surrender document in English, Russian, and German, with the English and Russian versions proclaimed in the document itself as the only authoritative ones. Now, part of the thing they don't talk a lot about, this Flensburg government that Dönitz tried to form was on the Danish border, and he was joined there with the Oberkommand Generalleutnant or High Command of the Armed Forces under Wilhelm Keitel, who had previously relocated to Chemnitz near Potsdam, and then to Rheinberg during the Battle of Berlin. Now, Dönitz sought to present his government as unpolitical. However, there was no repudiation of Nazism. The Nazi Party was not banned. Leading Nazis were not detained, and the symbols of Nazism would remain in place. Well, due to these shortcomings, neither the Soviets nor the Americans would recognize Dönitz or the Flensburg government as capable of representing the German state. Now, interesting enough, after Hitler's death, the German armies were still in pockets all over Europe. They were in pockets along the Atlantic, at La Rochelle, St. Nazarene, Lorient, Dunkirk, and the Channel Islands, the Greek islands of Crete, Rhodes, and the Nicomedes, most of Norway, Denmark, the northwestern Netherlands, northern Croatia, northern Italy, Austria, Bohemia and Moravia, the Courland Peninsula in Latvia, the Helpets Peninsula in Poland, and in Germany towards Hamburg, facing British and Canadian forces, in Mecklenburg, Pomerania, and the besieged city of Breslau, facing Soviet forces, and in southern Bavaria towards Breslausen, facing American French forces. So the big thing to look at is that Russia, Soviet Union, when they penetrated through, they made quick work of Berlin. They surrounded it, cut it off from its forces, and Berlin was basically in for a world of hurt. The other thing to realize is that by this time, in 1945, most of Germany was being defended by, 60-year-old men and kids, because most of the soldiers were already either prisoners of war, dead, or, they were already in the military. Germany was simply just running out of soldiers.
Oh, no, they ran out of soldiers?
Yes.
How dare they?
As we mentioned before, as the situation in Berlin got worse, those extra positions started surrendering, on their own grounds. And by the time they got to the 8th of May, that's when they finally said, I don't think we've got a chance anymore.
We don't have a lot of options.
Now, I do have to say that I can kind of understand why Germany held out as long as it could. They've been fighting the Soviets nonstop, since they crossed into the Soviets had occupied the eastern half of Poland, and it was almost a constant battle between Germany and the Soviets. And the Soviets lost a lot of civilians, they lost a lot of territory, they lost a lot of equipment, and then once the shoe was on the other foot, the Soviets were just constantly attacking. Germany was put on the defensive, and they basically had to hold that defense for the next X number, months. Of course, then the Allies made two front lines. They invaded Italy and pushed up the boot, and then we had D-Day happen in 1944, and that really threw everything off, because all of a sudden the Germans were backpedaling out of France and Belgium, and even their last ditch effort on the Western Front, when they did the Battle of the Bulge, it was a close idea, but they were just running out of supplies. They didn't have the gas for the tanks, and they ran out just short of where they needed to get, and it was kind of like the last throw. Interestingly enough, though, when it came down to surrendering, the Allies had already been negotiating and trying to figure out what would be the best way for the war to go down in stages, for surrenders, who would occupy what. And they had also made mention of the fact that, the instrument of surrender to be signed by the representatives of the German High Command. They didn't want a repeat of World War I's effort, where it was just civilians. They wanted the High Command of the Army to take care of this in the defeat itself. Interesting enough, not everyone would agree with this committee's predictions. The ambassador, Sir William Strang, the British representative at the EAC, the European Advisory Commission, said that it's impossible to, at present to foresee that what circumstances hostilities with Germany will be suspended. We cannot tell, therefore, what mode of procedure would be most suitable, whether, for example, it will be found best to have a full and detailed armistice or a shorter armistice conferring general powers, or possibly no armistice at all, but a series of local capitulations by enemy commanders. As you just heard, the Germans started surrendering all over. You know, they surrendered in Italy, they surrendered in the Netherlands, they surrendered in parts of Germany, they surrendered to the Soviets. You know, it went by stages. And of course, obviously, once Berlin was captured, it was kind of like, well, for the bad analogy, a chess game. The king is dead, you know, game over. Surrender terms for Germany were initially discussed on a meeting with the EAC on the 14th of January 1944, and a three-part text was agreed upon on the 28th of July 1944 and adopted by the three Allied powers. The first part consisted of a brief preamble. The German government and German High Command, recognizing and acknowledging the complete defeat of the German armed forces on land, sea, and the air, hereby announce Germany's unconditional surrender. The second part, Articles 1 through 5, are related to the military surrender by the German High Command of all forces on land, at sea, and in the air to the surrender of their weapons, to their evacuation from any territory outside German boundaries as they stood on the 31st of December 1937, and their ability to captivity as prisoners of war. The third part, Articles 6 through 12, were related to the surrender of the German government to Allied representatives of almost all of its powers and authority, the release and repatriation of prisoners and forced laborers, the cessation of radio broadcasts, the provision of intelligence and information, the maintenance of weapons and infrastructure, the yielding of Nazi leaders for war crimes trials, and the power of Allied representatives to issue proclamations, orders, ordinances, and instructions covering additional political, administrative, economic, financial, military, and other requirements arising from the complete defeat of Germany. Now, the key article in the third section was Article 12, which provided that the German government and German High Command would comply fully with any proclamations, orders, ordinances, and instructions of the accredited Allied representatives. The Allies understood that this, allowing unlimited scope to impose arrangements for the restitution and reparations of damages, Articles 13 and 14 specified the date of surrender and the languages of the definitive texts. Well, the Yalta Conference, which took place in February 1945, had led to further development of the terms of surrender, as it was agreed that the administration of post-war Germany would be split into 4 occupation zones for the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the United States. It was also agreed that an additional clause 12A would be added to the July 1944 surrender text and stated that the Allied representatives will take such steps, including the complete disarmament, demilitarization, and dismemberment of Germany as they deem requisite for future peace and security. Now, the provisional government for the French Republic, however, was not party to the Yalta Agreement and refused to recognize it, which created a diplomatic problem as formal inclusion of the additional clause in the EAC text, which inevitably create a French demand for equal representation in any dismemberment discussions. While this was unresolved, there was, in effect, 2 versions of that EAC text, one with the dismemberment clause and one without. Now, by the end of March 1945, the British government began to doubt whether, once Germany had been completely overpowered, there would be any post-Nazi German civil authority capable of signing the instrument of surrender or putting its provisions into effect. I mean, they pretty much wiped out every form of leadership that they had in the commanders.
Right.
They proposed that the EAC text should be redrafted as unilateral declaration of German defeat by Allied powers and their assumption of supreme authority following the total dissolution of the German state. It was in this form that the text agreed by the EAC was finally effected as the declaration regarding the defeat of Germany. Meanwhile, the combined chiefs of staff of the Western Allies agreed in August of 1944 to general guidelines for the terms of local military surrenders to be concluded with any capitulating German forces that mandated that capitulation had to be unconditional and restricted to the purely military aspects of local surrender, and that no commitments were given to the enemy. That surrender was to be without prejudice to any subsequent general instrument of surrender, which might replace any document of partial surrender, and which would be jointly imposed on Germany by the three primary Allied powers. These guidelines formed the basis of a series of partial capitulations of German forces to the Western Allies in April and May of 1945, like we just saw.
Right.
As the German surrender happened, the EAC text was substituted by a simplified military-only version based on the wording of the partial surrender of German forces in Italy signed at the surrender of Castera. The reason for the change was disputed, but many have reflected awareness of the reservations being expressed as the capability of German signatories to agree the provisions of the full text or the continued uncertainty over communicating the dismemberment clause to the French. Now, as mentioned, the German military commanders in Italy had been conducting secret negotiations for a partial surrender, which came into effect, was signed on the 29th of April, 1945, coming into effect on the 2nd. Originally, Kesselring, the overall military commander of the OKW South, denounced capitulation, but once Hitler's death had been confirmed, he acceded to it. German forces in northwest Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, and Schleswig-Holstein was taken care of on the 4th. German forces in southern Germany on the 5th, with forces in Bavaria and southwest Germany signed an act at Haar outside Munich, coming into effect on the 6th. The impetus for the Kesselring capitulation had arisen from within a German military command, but from May 2nd, the Donetsk government assumed control of the process, pursuing a deliberate policy of successful partial capitulations in the West to play for time in order to bring as many as possible to the eastern military formations westward, so to save them from Soviet or Yugoslav captivity. That makes sense. Needless to say, a lot of soldiers of Germany wound up in Russia, usually never returned. They got hauled off to Siberia and either froze to death or were, well, straight outright killed.
What?
Surrender of them intact to the British and Americans. In addition, Donetsk hoped to continue to evacuate soldiers and civilians by sea from the Hela Peninsula around the Baltic coastal areas. Donetsk and Katel were resolved against issuing any orders to surrender to Soviet forces, not only from undiminished anti-Bolshevism, but also because they could not be confident they would be obeyed, and might consecutively place troops continuing to fight in the position of refusing a direct order, thereby stripping them of any legal protection as prisoners of war. So these surrenders in the West had succeeded in ceasing hostilities between the Western Allies and German forces almost on all fronts. At the same time, however, the broadcast orders of the Donetsk government continued to oppose any acts of German surrender to Soviet forces in Courland, Bohemia, and Mecklenburg. Indeed, attempting to countermand ongoing surrender negotiations both in Berlin and Breslau, German forces in the east were ordered instead to fight their way westwards. Clench a hole, get out of there. Can't blame them. German forces in the east were, again, conscious that if this was to continue, the Soviet command would suspect Western Allies were intending a separate peace, as indeed that's exactly what Donetsk was intention. Eisenhower determined that no further partial surrenders would be agreed on in the West, but instead instructed the Donetsk government to send representatives to SHAEF headquarters at Reims to agree terms for the general surrender of all German forces simultaneously to all Allied powers, including the Soviets. Well, following the surrender, the major remaining German forces in the field consisted of Army Group E, facing Yugoslav forces in Croatia, the remains of Army Group Vistola, facing the Soviet forces in Mecklenburg, and Army Group Center, facing Soviet forces in eastern Bohemia and Moravia, engaging the brutal suppression of the Prague Uprising. An occupying army of around 400,000, while the German troops remained in Norway under command of General Franz Boheim, who was contacted by the German minister in Sweden early on, the 6th of May, to determine whether further capitulation might be arranged for his forces, with neutral Sweden acting as an intermediary, but was unwilling to comply with anything other than general surrender from the German High Command of the Obercommander West. After these partial surrenders and the signing at Reims, Germany decided its final documents of surrender to the Allied side in Berlin. But basically, that's where, Germany on the 8th, would make their major sign. The first one is at Reims on the 7th at Central European time, but they made the second sign on the 8th, the 48-hour grace period having been backdated to the start of final negotiations. The unconditional surrender of German armed forces was signed by Joel on behalf of the OKW. General Walter Bedell Smith signed on behalf of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. General Ivan Suslov on behalf of the Soviet High Command. French Major General Francois Sevitz signed as an official witness. Eisenhower had proceeded throughout the consultation with General Alexei Antonov of the Soviet High Command, and at his request, General Suslov had been seconded by the SHAEF headquarters to represent the Soviet High Command in the surrender negotiations. The text of this act of surrender, had been telegraphed to General Antonov in the early hours of the 7th of May, but no confirmation of Soviet approval had been received by the time of the surrender ceremony, nor was there confirmation if General Suslov was empowered to sign as representing the Soviet High Command. Accordingly, Eisenhower agreed with Suslov that a separate text should be signed by the German emissaries, undertaking the fully empowered representatives of each of the German armed services would attend a formal ratification of the act of surrender at a time and a place designated by the Allied High Command. At the definitive surrender signing in Berlin, some 6 hours after the Reims signing, a response was received by Soviet High Command stating that the act of surrender was unacceptable, both because the text differed from the agreed EAC and because Suslov had not been empowered to sign. These objectives were, however, pretext. The substantive Soviet objection was the act of surrender ought to be a unique, singular, historical event, fully reflecting the leading contribution of the Soviet people to the final victory. They maintained that it should not be held on a liberated territory that had been victimized by German aggression, but the seat of government where the German aggression sprang, Berlin. Furthermore, the Soviets pointed out that although the terms of surrender signed in Reims required German forces to cease all military activities and remain in their current positions, they were not explicitly required to lay down their arms and give themselves up. What has to happen here is the surrender of German troops giving themselves up as prisoners. Eisenhower immediately agreed, acknowledging that the act of surrender signed in Reims should be considered a brief instrument of the unconditional military surrender, and undertook to attend the correctly accredited representatives of the German High Command for a more formal signing of a suitably amended text presided over by Marshal Georgy Zhukov in Berlin on the 8th of May. Furthermore, he issued a clarificatory statement that any German forces continuing to fight against the Soviets after the stated deadline would no longer have the status of soldiers, and hence, if they were to surrender to the Americans or British, would be then handed back into Soviet captivity. Ouch.
Ouch.
Well, the effect of the Reims signing was limited to a consolidation of the effective ceasefire between German forces and Western Allies. Fighting continued unabated in the east, however, especially as German forces now intensified their air and ground assault against the Prague Uprising. While the seaborne evacuation of German troops across the Baltic continued, Donitz issued new commands that resistance to Soviet forces should be maintained, taking advantage of the 48-hour grace period in order to redouble efforts to save German military units from Soviet captivity. And it soon became clear he had authorized the signing of general surrender at Reims in bad faith, and that consequently neither the Soviet command nor the German forces would accept the Reims surrender as effecting an end to hostilities between them. General Ferdinand Schroeder, commanding Army Group Central, broadcasted a message to his troops on the 8th denouncing false rumors that the Oberkommando West had surrendered to the Soviet command as well as the Western Allies. The struggle in the West, however, is over, but there can be no question of surrender to the Bolsheviks. Why, they still love each other, don't they?
Love.
Consequently, Eisenhower arranged for the commanders and the chief of each of the 3 German armed forces to be flown from Flensburg to Berlin early on the 8th of May, where they were kept waiting through the day until 10 p.m. when the Allied delegation arrived, at which point amended surrender text was provided to them. The definitive act of military surrender was dated as being signed before midnight on the 8th of May at the seat of Soviet military administration in Berlin-Karlhorst, now the location of the Museum Berlin-Karlhorst. Since Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander for Western Europe, technically outranked Zhukov, the act of signing on behalf of the Western Allies passed to his deputy, Air Chief Marshal.
Are you sure?
Yes, Marshal Tedder. The proposed Soviet amendments to the Reims surrender text were accepted without difficulty by the Western Allies, but the identification and designation of the Allied signatories proved more problematic. French forces operated under Schaeff's command, but General de Gaulle was demanding that General de Gaulle sign separately from the French High Command, but in that case it would be politically unacceptable for there to be no American signature on the definitive surrender document, while the Soviets would not agree to be more than 3 Allied signatories in total, one of whom would have to be Zhukov. After repeated redrafts, after all the needed translating and retyping, it was finally agreed that both the French and American signatories would be as witnesses. But the consequence was that the final versions were not ready for signing until after midnight. Consequently, the physical signing was delayed until nearly 1 a.m. on May 9th, Central European Time, and then backdated to the 8th to be consistent with the Reims Agreement and the public announcements of surrender already made by Western leaders.
We kind of did it on the 8th. Kind of. Depending on what time zone you're in.
Yeah, I was going to say, keep moving the time zone back. There we go. See, now it's 8 o'clock here. Now it's on the 8th. So officially, according to the Soviet declaration stating that the signing took place at 22:43 Central European Time on the 8th of May, meaning the signing still took place before the German surrender took effect. This definitive act of military surrender differed from the Reims Agreement signing principally in respect of requiring 3 German signatories who could fully represent all 3 armed services together with the German High Command. Otherwise, the amended text sent out an expanded Article 2 now requiring the German forces to disarm and hand over their weapons to local Allied commanders. This clause had the effect of ensuring that German military forces not only ceased military operations, but also disarmed themselves, disbanded, and be taken into captivity. Keitel initially balked at this amended text, proposing that an additional grace period of 12 hours be granted to surrendering German forces before they might be exposed to punitive damage for non-compliance under Article 5. In the event, he had to be satisfied with a verbal assurance from Zhukov. I would.
What?
Admiral Friedberg was the only representative of the German forces to be present at the signing of German instruments of surrender at Lüneburg Heath on the 4th of May, at Reims on the 7th, and Berlin on the 8th of May 1945. So talk about your flying around the country, even as an admiral.
Right.
But effectively, it ended one of the biggest and costliest world wars that we've had to deal with in history. And to this day, they're still pulling out, relics and artifacts from the World War. And all you can do is hope that maybe we've gotten smarter.
No.
No, we still fight wars.
We haven't gotten smarter.
No. We've learned how to kill people more easier, but we still fight wars for silly reasons. And all I can say is let's see, 1945 to 2025. 60, 70, 80, 80 years has gone by. So, but folks, this has been the Bearded Historian who's got a headache and my sinuses are fogged up.
Oh no, drugs.
Take care, and we will talk to you guys next week.